In the summer of 1867, a supply train bound for a Kansas outpost lost 4 days to washed-out crossings, and by the time it rolled through the gate, the fresh beef was long gone. What the troopers had left was salt pork, 12 ounces a day of it, cured so hard a man could crack a tooth on the rind. Number 14 on this list was mocked in letters home, yet it carried an entire command through a Dakota winter. Number 3 required nothing but a skillet, a fire, and a strong stomach. And the meal at number 1, most troopers ate it at a trot, one hand on the reins, and never once called it a meal. These 25 dishes came out of saddlebags, mess kettles, and holes dug in the prairie. Hit subscribe if you like history that actually tastes like something. Let's start with number 25. Number 25. Freshened pork, boiled in 3 waters, was the first lesson every recruit learned, and the one that separated the veterans from the fools. Salt pork came out of the barrel packed in brine, strong enough to sting a cut, and a man who threw it straight into the pan learned quickly that salt alone could ruin a supper. The old hands soaked it overnight in whatever water they could spare, then boiled it, poured off the gray scum, and boiled it again. 2 changes if there was time. 3 if the pork had ridden a long way in a hot wagon. What came out was pale, soft, and mild enough to eat without reaching for the canteen every second bite. Regimental cooks guarded the trick jealously, and quartermaster records show whole companies going through their water ration on nothing but pork. It was not a recipe. It was the price of admission. Number 24. Salt pork broiled on a ramrod turned the simplest fire into a kitchen and required no cookware at all. A trooper cut a slab about a ½ inch thick, ran it onto a green stick or the ramrod from his carbine, and held it over the coals until the edges bubbled and curled and the fat began to run. Grease dripped into the fire and flared, throwing light across the picket line and filling the camp with a smell that carried farther than any bugle. The meat came off half-charred and blistering hot, and men ate it straight off the rod with a piece of hard bread held underneath to catch what fell. Diaries describe this as the taste of a night halt: smoke, salt, and a slab of fat that had traveled 200 miles in a canvas sack. It fed a man in 10 minutes and asked nothing of the quartermaster but the pork itself. Number 23. Salt pork gravy poured over hard bread was the closest thing to a hot supper a scouting party ever got. After the pork was fried, the pan held a ½ inch of clear, rendered fat with brown scraps at the bottom, and no trooper alive would throw that away. A spoonful of flour went in, stirred until it browned and thickened, then water or coffee, added a little at a time until it turned into something you could pour. The hard bread went into a tin plate, the gravy went over the top, and the men waited a minute for the biscuit to soften enough to yield to a fork. Oral histories from frontier posts recall the sound of it, the scrape of tin, the quiet, while everyone ate. It was flour, fat, and salt. It also tasted, for about 4 minutes, like somebody's kitchen back home. Number 22. Cush was the Southern troopers' answer to the same problem, and it moved north through captured haversacks and shared campfires until half the cavalry on the continent knew it. Salt pork was cut fine and fried until the fat rendered out. Then crumbled cornbread or crushed hard bread went into the pan with a little water, and everything got stirred into a thick, steaming mush. Some men added a wild onion if the ground offered one. Most did not bother. It cooked in a single skillet in under 15 minutes, which mattered enormously to a column that might be ordered back into the saddle at any moment. Veterans wrote about Cush with genuine affection long after the war, describing it as the one field dish that filled a man and stayed with him. It was ugly on the plate and beloved in memory, which describes a great deal of soldier cooking. Number 21. Slumgullion, or just slum, was whatever the mess had left thrown into one kettle and boiled until the differences stopped mattering. Salt pork was always the foundation because salt pork was always there. Around it went beans if there were beans, rice if there was rice, a handful of flour to thicken, and any vegetable that had survived the wagons. The result ranged from a decent stew to a gray soup that men described in language a family channel cannot repeat. Company cooks were judged on their slum the way a housewife was judged on her pie crust, and a good one earned a reputation that followed him from post to post. Oral histories from the frontier army recall the line at the kettle, tin cups banging, and the standing joke that you never asked what was in the slum. You only asked whether there was more. Number 20, salt pork with desiccated vegetables gave the Army its most famous failure, and quietly, one of its most important meals. The vegetables arrived as compressed cakes, dried carrot, turnip, cabbage, and onion pressed into slabs that looked more like roofing material than food. Soldiers called them desecrated vegetables, and meant it. Dropped into a kettle with boiling water and chunks of salt pork, though, they swelled into something resembling a soup, and the pork fat gave the whole thing a body and richness it could not manage alone. Surgeons pushed the ration hard because they understood, imperfectly but correctly, that men living on pork and biscuit developed swollen gums and loose teeth. The taste was widely despised. The effect was real. Every regiment had at least one veteran who admitted decades later that the stuff he complained about loudest was probably the reason he still had his teeth. Number 19. Lobscouse came into the cavalry from the Navy and the merchant fleet, carried west by men who had spent time on ships before they spent it on horses. Salt pork was cut into cubes and simmered until tender. Then hard bread was broken up and dropped in with whatever potatoes or onions the mess could produce. Everything cooked down together until the biscuit dissolved and the mixture thickened into a coarse, savory hash that held the shape of a spoon. It was one of the few field dishes that improved with time on the fire, which suited a command settling in for the night. Here is where things get interesting, though. Lobscouse was one of the earliest recorded ways of making old, weevil-touched hard bread genuinely palatable, because long boiling broke the biscuit down completely. What the pantry could not fix, the kettle could. Number 18. Salt pork and rice fed the frontier army through the years when beans ran short and the supply contracts favored whatever was cheapest by the hundredweight. The regulation ration allowed 10 pounds of rice or hominy for every 100 rations, and rice traveled better than almost anything else in the wagons. Cooks boiled it soft, then stirred in diced salt pork that had been fried until the edges crisped, letting the grease work through the grains until every spoonful carried a little salt and shine. It was mild, filling, and easy on men who had been sick, which is why post-hospitals leaned on it heavily. Letters from Western garrisons mention rice and pork, the way modern people mention leftovers, as a fact of life rather than a meal. Unremarkable, endlessly repeated, and responsible for keeping thousands of men upright. Number 17. PA soup with salt pork was the cold weather workhorse, the dish that appeared the moment the wind turned and stayed until spring. Dried peas swelled to 3 times their size in the kettle, and a chunk of pork, simmered in the middle of them, gave up its salt and fat slowly over 2 or 3 hours until the whole pot turned thick, yellow, and heavy. Men sopped it with hard bread. Officers ate the same thing from better dishes. At isolated posts through the 1870s, the pea and pork kettle went on the stove in the morning and was still being ladled out at evening stables, topped up with water as it went down. The smell got into wool and stayed there. Veterans recalled that you could tell what season it was inside a barracks with your eyes closed, just from whether the air smelled of peas. Number 16, dough gods, the Army's name for dumplings, turned a thin pork stew into something that could hold a man through a night on picket. Flour, a pinch of salt, and enough water to make a stiff dough were worked together on a saddle blanket or a mess chest lid, torn into lumps and dropped straight into simmering pork broth. They swelled as they cooked, soaking up the fat and salt, and came out dense enough that soldiers joked about issuing them as ammunition. That density was exactly the point. Flour was cheap, filling, and available when meat was not, and a handful of dough could stretch a 2-pound piece of pork across 8 men. Company records from Western posts show flour arriving by the barrel while meat arrived by the pound, and the dough god is the arithmetic of that imbalance served hot. Number 15. Fried cornmeal mush in pork grease was breakfast for men who had eaten the same supper 3 nights running and needed something that felt different. Cornmeal was boiled thick the evening before, poured into a mess pan, and left overnight until it set firm as a brick in the cold air. In the morning it was cut into slabs and laid into a skillet slick with the previous day's pork fat, where it crisped golden on both sides while the inside stayed soft. Molasses went over it if the ration allowed, and if it did not, the men ate it plain and did not complain much. Southern troopers and Western frontier soldiers alike swore by this, and it cost the Army almost nothing. Every part of it was left over. That was the genius of it, and the reason it never made a cookbook. Number 14. Hardtack pudding was the dish soldiers mocked in letters home and then made again the following week. Hard bread was pounded to crumbs in a canvas sack with the butt of a carbine, mixed with water until it formed a paste, then enriched with rendered salt pork fat and whatever sweetness existed in the camp, usually molasses or a little sugar from the coffee ration. Dried apples went in when the wagons brought them. The mass was tied in a cloth and boiled or baked in a covered pan until it set into something dense and faintly sweet that could be sliced. Veterans described it as heavy enough to sink a boat. They also described eating every crumb. In a life of salt and grease, one sweet thing on a Sunday carried a weight out of all proportion to its ingredients. Number 13. Salt pork with molasses was the simplest trick in the entire repertoire and possibly the most surprising. Thin slices of pork were fried until the fat ran and the edges browned hard. Then a spoonful of molasses went into the hot pan and immediately began to bubble and darken. The sugar caught on the meat and turned glossy, and what came out was salty, sweet, and faintly burnt, spooned over hard bread while it was still too hot to be sensible about. Modern kitchens would recognize this instantly as candied pork belly and charge accordingly. Cavalry troopers in the 1860s called it a treat and made it whenever the molasses ration appeared, which was 1 gill for every man in the regulation issue. Here is the second pattern break, and it is worth sitting with. Some of the food we now call rustic and expensive was invented by men who had nothing. Number 12. Larded game was where salt pork stopped being a meal and became a tool. Antelope, jackrabbit, and prairie hens were shot whenever the column had the chance, and every one of them shared the same problem: almost no fat. Lean meat over an open fire turns dry and stringy within minutes. So troopers cut salt pork into thin strips and threaded them through the flesh with a knife point, or simply laid strips across the top and let them melt down as the meat cooked. The pork basted the game from the inside out, adding fat, salt, and enough flavor to disguise whatever the animal had been eating. Frontier cooks understood this instinctively long before anyone wrote it down. Restaurants charge for this technique today. On the plains, it was the difference between fresh meat that tasted like a meal and fresh meat that tasted like rope. Number 11. Salt pork with wild greens kept men healthy in a way the Army only half understood. Troopers who had grown up on farms recognized lamb's quarters, purslane, wild onion, and dock growing along creek bottoms, and they pulled them by the handful whenever a column halted near water. Boiled briefly with a piece of salt pork, the greens took on the fat and salt and lost their bitterness, and the pot liquor was drunk straight from the cup. Post surgeons noticed that commands with foragers who knew their plants suffered far less from swollen gums and aching joints than commands that lived strictly out of the wagons. Nobody at the time could have named the vitamin involved. They simply noticed that men who ate greens stayed on their horses. It was folk knowledge doing the work of medicine, one creek bank at a time. Number 10. Salt pork and hominy anchored the Southern cavalry table and followed those men west when the war ended, and many of them re-enlisted on the frontier. Dried hominy swelled slowly in the kettle over an hour or more, turning soft and starchy, and diced pork fried separately went in at the end with all of its grease. The regulation ration listed hominy as an alternative to rice, and in commands recruited below the Ohio River, it was chosen every single time. Men who had eaten it since childhood said it was the one Army dish that tasted like home rather than like the Army. There was a genuine regional divide in the ranks over this, and letters record real arguments about it. Rice men and hominy men shared a kettle, ate the same pork, and disagreed permanently about which one had been done a favor. Number 9. Salt pork and sauerkraut came out of the German regiments and spread because it worked. Barrels of shredded, salted cabbage traveled well, kept for months without ice, and cost the commissary almost nothing. Simmered for an hour with chunks of salt pork, the sourness of the kraut cut straight through the fat in a way nothing else on the ration list managed, and the pork mellowed the sharpness in return. Surgeons in the 1860s actively encouraged it because they had inherited generations of naval experience showing that pickled cabbage kept scurvy away on long voyages. The smell was divisive. Diaries record men eating outdoors in January rather than sit in a hut where kraut was cooking. The men who ate it anyway tended to keep their teeth, which was a persuasive argument then and remains one now. Number 8. Stewed tomatoes with salt pork and hard bread was one of the great luxuries of the canned goods era, and troopers treated it accordingly. Tinned tomatoes reached western posts in growing quantities after the Civil War, and a can opened into a kettle with fried salt pork and broken biscuit produced something startlingly close to a real supper. The acid in the tomatoes softened the hard bread fast, the pork fat gave it body, and the color alone lifted men who had been staring at gray food for weeks. Sugar went in if anyone had it. Post traders sold cans at prices that made a private wince, and men pooled money to buy them for holidays and paydays. Third pattern break, and here is the part nobody expects. The modern American tomato soup with crackers descends in spirit and structure from exactly this. Number 7. Winter quarters hash was what happened when a command finally stopped moving and had time to cook properly. Potatoes, when the wagons brought them, were boiled and cut rough. Salt pork was diced small and fried until the pieces browned and the fat pooled. Then the potatoes went in with onions and everything was pressed flat and left alone until a crust formed on the bottom. The trick was patience, which men on the march never had, and men in winter camp suddenly had too much of. Turned out onto a mess pan, cut into wedges, and eaten with a spoon. It was as good as Army food ever got. Oral histories from frontier garrisons mention hash mornings with real warmth. The regiment was not going anywhere. The stove was hot, and for once, nobody was in a hurry. Number 6. Flapjacks fried in sowbelly grease were the Sunday morning reward at every post and every long halt. Flour, a little salt, water, and whatever leavening the cook could scrounge were beaten into a batter and poured into a skillet already shining with rendered pork fat. They cooked fast, edges lacy and brown from the grease, and came off the pan smelling of smoke and salt pork, no matter how much molasses went over the top. That flavor was not a flaw. Men who grew up on these said afterward that plain butter-fried pancakes never tasted right to them again. A barrel of flour cost the commissary a fraction of what meat cost, and a good cook could turn out enough flapjacks to quiet a company. It was the cheapest morale the Army ever bought. Number 5. Bean-hole beans took a full day and were worth every hour, which is why they belonged to garrison life rather than the trail. A pit was dug and a fire burned down in it until the earth around it was hot through. Beans that had soaked overnight went into a heavy iron kettle with a thick piece of salt pork buried in the middle, molasses if it could be spared, and enough water to cover. The lid went on, the kettle went into the pit, coals and earth went over the top, and the whole thing was left until the next day. What came out was dark, soft, and sweet, the pork falling apart into the beans, and the fat carrying molasses into every one. Cooks at frontier posts competed over this. Men timed their return from patrol around it. Number 4. The company kettle stew was the daily reality of Army cooking, and it deserves more respect than it usually gets. A single large kettle held enough for dozens of men, and into it went salt pork as the base, beans or rice for bulk, flour for thickening, and any vegetable that had not spoiled. It simmered for hours while the company drilled, groomed horses, and stood inspection, and it was ladled out at the end of the day into whatever tin each man carried. The quality depended entirely on the cook, and a bad one could make a company miserable in a way no officer could fix. Records show cooks being quietly rotated out after complaints. It was monotonous, endlessly variable, and the single most common hot meal in the mounted service. Most troopers ate some version of it 1,000 times. Number 3. Skilly Gully was the dish that defined the era, and it took 2 ingredients and about 6 minutes. Hard bread was soaked in water until the outside softened, but the center still held, then dropped into a skillet of sizzling salt pork fat and fried until both sides turned brown and crisp. The biscuit drank the grease and came out somewhere between a crouton and a fritter, hot enough to burn a mouth and salty enough to send men straight for their canteens. Every veteran memoir mentions it. Every soldier had an opinion about how long to soak. It solved 2 problems at once. It made hard bread edible, and it used up fat that would otherwise congeal in the pan. Nothing else in the ration was this efficient. Take 2 things nobody wanted separately, and make them into the meal everyone remembered. Number 2, pork and beans was the ration that never failed, the meal that appeared when everything else had run out or gone bad. The regulation issue allowed roughly 15 pounds of beans for every 100 rations, and beans kept indefinitely, weighed little for the calories they carried, and asked nothing of a cook but time. Soaked beans went into the kettle with a chunk of salt pork and were left to simmer until the beans broke down and the fat worked all the way through. Molasses turned it sweet. Nothing turned it bad. It fed cavalry columns across a continent, appeared on frontier post menus for decades, and eventually walked straight out of the Army and onto grocery shelves, where the canned version still sits today. Every trooper on this list ate it. Most of them ate it more than any other hot food in their service. And finally, number 1, raw salt pork on hard bread eaten in the saddle was the meal that defined cavalry service, and almost nobody who ate it would have called it cooking. On scout, in enemy country, or simply too far from water to justify a fire, a trooper reached into his haversack, cut a thin slice off the slab with his pocket knife, laid it across a piece of hard bread, and ate it at a walk with the reins in his other hand. There was no fire, no kettle, no pan to clean, and no smoke to give away a position. The pork was cold, firm, and salty enough to make a man ration his canteen carefully for the rest of the day. Veterans wrote about it without much affection and with enormous familiarity. It was the taste of long marches, of dust and leather, and the particular hunger of men who had been moving since before dawn. 12 ounces of pork and a pound of biscuit was what the regulations promised. This was what those numbers actually looked like, hour after hour, mile after mile. Every other dish on this list was an attempt to escape it. This was the meal they always came back to, because it was the only one that required nothing at all. Across all 25 entries, from freshening pork in 3 waters to that cold slice eaten in the saddle, one truth runs through every kettle and skillet. These men were not cooking. They were solving a problem with salt, fat, flour, and fire, and they solved it well enough to cross a continent on horseback. Which of these would you actually eat? Tell me in the comments, and if you would try the molasses pork, I want to know how it went.